Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2024 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Christoph Korshane. I'm the Interim Director of the Environmental Law Center and the Director of the Environmental Advocacy Clinic here at Vermont Law and Graduate School, where I'm also an Associate Professor of Law. We're pleased to welcome you to the presentation today. As with all our prior talks, each one is worth one Vermont CLE credit. So please keep track of which talks you attend for your records. We'll have some time for Q&A after today's presentation. And for those watching on the VLGS YouTube page, you will see a chat box on your right, and you may enter questions into that space at any time during the presentation, so you don't have to hold them back. And we'll get through as many as we can towards the end of the presentation. What I will say is that we're pleased to welcome for today's talk, Josh Galperin. He's an Associate Professor of Law at the Elizabeth Howe School of Law at Pace University. He's previously served on the faculty at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and was a student nominee for the Distinguished Public Service Professor Award and a Dean's nominee for the Provost's Diversity in the Curriculum Award. He was also a two-time winner of the Most Valuable Professor Award, an MVP for sure. He also previously served as the director of the Environmental Protection Clinic and as a lecturer in law and a research scholar at Yale Law School, and a lecturer and the Environmental Law and Policy Program Director at the Yale School of the Environment. In addition to directing and teaching the Environmental Protection Clinic, Professor Galperin directed the dual law environment degree program between YSE and Pace, Vermont, and Yale Law Schools. He was a lead collaborator in the Land Use Collaborative between YSE and Pace. He was the Associate Director for the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy and received the award for Excellence in Research, Teaching, and Service from the YSE graduating class of 2017. His research and teaching cover environmental law, administrative law, food and agriculture law and policy, property, constitutional law, and tort law. He has published extensively, and his work appears in many law journals. Before Yale, Professor Galperin worked for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, where he was a policy analyst and research attorney. And before SACE, Josh was a legislative counsel for the Vermont General Assembly, where he primarily staffed the House and Senate committees on agriculture. He holds a JD from none other than Vermont Law and Graduate School, magna cum laude, and a master's degree in environmental management from the Yale School of the Environment, then the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and a bachelor's degree in political science with a minor in wildlife conservation from the University of Delaware. Today, we're thrilled to have him present his talk on Towards Democratic Environmental Governance. And so please join me in welcoming Professor Josh Galperin.
Hey, folks, and thank you, Christoph. If I were giving my own introduction, I would have started with the fact that I'm a Vermont Law School graduate, and I also that you say I've published in many places, but I've twice published in the Vermont Law Review, which I'm very proud of. So that's where I would have started, but that's okay. I like to hear all of that long intro too. So folks, thank you very much for having me. I am I think sharing my screen, and I'm going to get my cursor in the right place, put on the presenter view here. Okay, Christoph, can you see just the slide title here?
Looks great.
Okay, terrific. So I'll just dive right in. My hope is that if anything, I'll go short and leave plenty of time for Q&A. I can't say for sure. I haven't timed myself, but I'll do my best. What I want to talk about today is, broadly speaking, democratic governance, how we govern in a pluralistic, divided society, how we govern in a way that is genuinely democratic. But because I am an environmental scholar as much as I am an administrative governance and democracy scholar, I really want to focus on democratic governance in the environmental space. So here's the sort of outline plan that I've got for today. First, I know I'm talking about democracy. I'm championing democracy, and that's not a hard thing to verbalize, but it's a little bit harder to explain why democracy. So I want to talk for a minute about why democracy. That piece of the conversation is largely based on a book chapter I have forthcoming about environmental myth making. I won't spend too much time on that, but I want to mention it. Then I'll spend some time defining democracy. That's part 2 of the talk. What is democracy? Based on an article that just came out in Villanova Law Review this past spring called A Restatement of Democracy. And then I want to try to tie those themes together in a case study of private environmental governance. I've got a couple, I've written a bunch about private environmental governance. I have these 2 specific articles I want to draw on. The first is the environmental governance at the edge of democracy. I think it came out last year. That's what I wrote on the slide. And then a forthcoming article in Arizona State Law Review, which should come out very soon, about environmental governance, and specifically private environmental governance, and what private environmental governance has to do with democracy. So I will get started. Get started by this first question: why democracy? And you don't have to read this entire block quote here. I try not to have too many of these, but the point of this block quote is that for a long time there's this myth and this idea of mythology really isn't that important to the argument I want to make here, even though it was the theme of what I was writing about when I wrote the chapter on which this part of the talk is based. But this myth of balance of nature, this basic idea that the reason we need to protect the environment, and the way we protect the environment, is by thinking about balance. If environment goes out of balance, that's bad. We've done some kind of harm, and we have to protect it. That's what sort of triggers the need for environmental protection. And then we can identify whether the protection is successful by whether or not we rebalance the environment. For a long time, this has been a core ideal or myth of many environmental decision makers. And Daniel Botkin, who wrote this book, Discordant Harmonies, in the 1990s, in which he was critiquing the idea of balance of nature, he, in addition to having been at one time a preeminent critic of this concept of balance of nature, he also has defined it very clearly, which is why I use this quote. But the basic argument I have made about balance of nature is that it's not a real thing. It is in fact a myth. It is not a fair description of how nature actually works. And we've known this for a very long time. So when Botkin was writing in the 1990s, when in fact a lot of environmental scholars, including environmental lawyers, were writing about the concept of balance of nature in the 1990s and realizing at that time, you know what, this isn't good. Is all of our environmental law, are we doing it all wrong? Because we've been framing it around this concept of balance, which isn't real. There was this sort of freak out moment in environmental law and environmental policy scholarship in the 1990s, roughly around the time that Botkin wrote Discordant Harmonies. But the fact is, scholars, scientists have known for a long time that balance of nature was not a real thing. Here is a quote from Alfred Russel Wallace. He wrote this in 1855, and this was quoted at least as early, known to scientists at least as early as 1966, but basically saying there's no such thing as balance of nature. Balance of nature is not a real scientific concept, which makes us wonder. And in the 1990s, again, a lot of people were saying, does that mean environmental law is all wrong? Have we been creating law, but creating law just wayward law with no grounding in real authoritative guidance for how we should do it? And the answer, of course, is no. Environmental law is not all wrong. Balance of nature was one myth, remains a myth. I mean, if you look at the way people talk about environmental protection today, 90% of the time you will see actual writings that evoke the term balance of nature, or at least implicitly invoke the concept of balance. So balance of nature is one myth among many myths about how or why we should protect the environment. Some folks talk about welfare economics and say, well, we want to do what's best for the greatest number. We need to do cost-benefit balancing and this sort of thing. And when we do that and we properly balance the value of nature, you'll see that, of course, we have to protect it because it creates all this value for people. And you see that manifest in things like ecosystem services and so on. This, I would assert, is also a myth about how we protect nature. Things like dominion and providence, more sort of religion-based ideas about how and why we protect nature, the Gaia hypothesis, or modern terms that you may have heard like sustainability, reconciliation, stewardship. These are all just different values that drive people to protect the environment and help guide their sort of framework for how to protect the environment. The problem is these are all not necessarily in conflict with one another, but they are all very different and they come from different places. And so the question we have to ask is, how do we reconcile all of these different values or ideals or myths that push us towards environmental protection? Well, one option would be we could just have a green dictator who says, this is how we're going to do it, and that's that, and we're going to fix climate change, and we're going to shut down coal, and we're going to do all these great things that we ought to be doing, but somebody's just going to impose that upon us. Many of you, I'm sure, have, maybe not so much these days, but in the early, let's say 10 years ago or so, people were looking towards China and hearing China talk about all the great environmental things they were going to do, while the U.S. was struggling to get much of anything done, still is, of course. And there was this sort of turn towards, oh, well, China is going to lead the way. I mean, maybe not, probably not. But one of the reasons people were praising, those folks who were praising the Chinese path to environmental protection, taking for granted that it actually is or was a path to environmental protection, the reason was because really it was possible for China to do things because it operates a little bit like a dictatorship. So that's one option. Another option for how we reconcile all these various ideals is sort of pure rationality. We don't need to balance between them, because we can just use our powerful human intellect and reason our way through philosophical thinking from first principles or mathematic, rationality, reason our way to the right solution. But that is also not likely to work for a variety of reasons. The first of which is that we don't really have fundamental ideals off of which, or first principles off of which to operate. And also, we're just not actually that rational. So how then do we reconcile all the various ideals? Well, my argument, which, by the way, I didn't invent this idea at all, democracy. I'm not the first person, again, to suggest that democracy is a way for governing in a pluralistic society. And whether you're looking at ancient Athenian democracy or more modern versions of democracy, one of the key justifications for the concept of democracy is that it helps make decisions, it helps govern, it helps shape the way institutions work in a society with lots of different competing ideals, lots of different competing goals. And that is, of course, true, or at least, of course, the way people promote democracy for governance at large. But it's also true for environmental governance specifically, because it is not as if there is only one environmental goal and only one way to reach that goal. The life and death of the balance of nature tells us that there is no one simple way to make environmental decisions. And in fact, environmental decisions are decisions that do not exist in a vacuum. They're part of the larger pluralistic decision-making process. And so democracy needs to apply to environmental decision-making just as much as it does to all public decision-making, I'll just stop at that thought. All public decision-making. So that brings us to the question then, what is democracy? If it's necessary for environmental decision-making, what is it, right? So I've proposed that democracy is really made up of 4 key elements. And these are not elements that I have invented myself. This is what, I think the way I want to say this is, what I have done here is a lot of reading about democracy, a lot of political theory reading, a lot of reading from legal scholars describing democracy. And what I've often seen is a bunch of different proposals for what the shape of democracy really ought to be. There's deliberative democracy, and there is agonistic democracy, and there is direct democracy, and so on and so forth. Minimalist democracy, where the list is really quite long. I won't get into all those details here, but what I've tried to do is is look at all the vast writing on democracy and try to distill the key elements that seem to be reflected in all of the different writings that sort of go across the theory of democracy. So what I want to do is propose 4 elements and briefly describe them here. The first element, voting, or what we more frequently, or I shouldn't say frequently, but in the scholarly literature we hear thought called majoritarianism. So, of course, majoritarianism has to be part of democracy. That is what the majority wants, is sort of an impulse or driver of democratic decision making. To a lot of thinkers, to a lot of folks in the general public, sort of majoritarianism, voting elections, that's where democracy begins and ends. They just say, democracy is failing, or democracy has succeeded, and what they mean is an election was fair, or an election wasn't fair. Actually, now that I'm saying that, I'm recalling that I wrote something about this specific issue also in the Vermont Law Review. So that's actually 3 publications in the Vermont Law Review, not just 2. So majoritarianism, perhaps the figurehead, the driver of democracy, but that's not all there is. Another really important aspect of democracy is this concept of individualism or individual contestation. That is the ability for an individual, whether or not they are a part of the majority, right? Even if the individual is a political minority, it's on the losing side of elections, to have the individual or individual groups have the opportunity to contest majoritarian decision making. This is through things like free speech, petitioning the government, suing. Right? There's a lot of different ways of an individual getting to push back against majoritarian decision making. So these are the first 2 elements, majoritarianism and individualism, and they really sort of draw on these sort of classically liberal ideals in democracy. That is, individuals are the classic liberalism, meaning that like the individual is the core entity in any governance system. The individual is what we worry about. Well, majoritarianism aggregates individuals and says, what do you as an individual believe? You can vote for that. An individual contestation says, what do you as an individual believe? Or are you as an individual harmed? And if so, you should be able to challenge the decisions of the majority in some way. But that's not all that there is to democracy. Another aspect of democracy is what I've termed reason giving. That is an expectation, a sort of a 2-sided expectation. One, that government decision makers, or at least I'll just say decision makers, period. That decision makers have a responsibility to explain why they do what they do. That decision makers have to give reasons for their actions. The other side of that coin is that the public, the governed, also have an opportunity to express themselves and give reasons for the values they hold, the positions they take, how they will participate in the majoritarian process, why they might contest government action in an individual contest. So reason giving, also really important. And then finally, deliberation, the deliberative process. That is, there needs to be a forum, there needs to be also 2-sided, there needs to be a forum, a requirement that the decision maker is deliberating, is thinking about what they're doing in some way, that they aren't acting by fiat and just randomly deciding what kind of policy to implement. There needs to be a deliberative component. And then on the flip side, that the governed, the public, also have the opportunity to deliberate themselves before participating in some way. Now, I said that majoritarianism and individual contestation draw on sort of classic liberalism. Reason giving and deliberation draw on a more, I don't really want to use the term communal, but for lack of a better term at the tip of my tongue, I'll just say communal aspect of public decision making. Because majoritarianism and individual contestation, these ideals, again, that they're based on the idea of the individual, and that the individual is sort of like a pre-political or apolitical being. That is, we know what our values are, we know what our positions are, and they just are what they are. They don't change, or they don't need to change. Whereas reason giving and deliberation, they're more referential. That is, the idea that people can give reasons, and government needs to give reasons, and people should deliberate, and the government must deliberate. This idea is that we participate as a group in the political process, and that political process can actually change our minds and cause us to vote differently or to contest or not contest government interaction in a different way. That is, we are shaped, our political perspectives are shaped by the democratic process. And so that's, to me, based on the reading I've done, sort of the core ideas, the core elements that make up democracy. I will go very quickly over this next piece, but I want to try to justify these four elements, not just from theory, but also from our constitutional structure. I'm not suggesting that the Constitution, I'm not about to suggest that the Constitution requires these four democratic elements, but I do want to suggest that we have these four elements, and we have seen these four elements in our US constitutional system, and as a result, you should not think I'm being fanciful or overly theoretical when I'm referring to these four elements. They are realistic, practical elements that really do describe at least some democratic institutions. So for instance, when we talk about majoritarianism, when we talk about voting, Article 1 of the Constitution, which provides for an elected Congress, and it actually also provides for the houses of Congress to make their own decisions based on voting and majority rules. So that's simple enough. We've all seen that. Individual contestation, I actually think I already mentioned this, but we've got the First Amendment free speech, free exercise, perhaps less relevant, and the First Amendment right to petition the government, all forms of contesting government action, of making sure that our voices are heard as individuals, not just in the aggregate as a member of the majority. Also, Article 3, that is the court system, the ability to go to court and hold the government or other actors to account, even if you lose in court. The fact that the courtroom door is supposed to be open and puts people on relatively equal footing to contest their positions in a government-sponsored forum. Reason giving, we can see in the 5th and 14th Amendment. I guess there's a lot more I can say about this. I'll just say the brief part. The requirements of due process, of reasonableness, and the government must explain what it's doing and why it's doing it under the heading of due process. And then deliberation, we can see this also in the First Amendment, freedom of speech or right of association. That is the ability to express what's thinking and have a back and forth about it, to debate those ideas. And then Article 1 and 2, here I'm just sort of referring to the concept of bicameralism and presentment. That is, the legislative process in the US is designed as a deliberative process. Now, we all know it's not that deliberative, but it's designed as a deliberative process. The Supreme Court has certainly referred to it as a deliberative process because the houses have to agree, and that requires some degree of deliberation and then turning it over to the president, who also has to agree or veto and then have a veto override, etc. But you can see how that is a deliberative process. So now we have a sense of what is democracy, at least in my mind, hopefully beyond that, but at least in my mind. And so for that, from this point, we can turn over to the last part of the talk, which is about private environmental governance. So let's begin with a question, and let me actually just say, so I want to frame this case study a little bit before I dive into it. I see private environmental governance as a case study because it is an example of a non-governmental institution. I'll explain that in a second. And and because it is a non-governmental institution, we as a democratic society have not imposed many of the requirements of democracy on it. So it allows us to sort of compare and contrast the democratic structures that I've just described in the public governance or government context into the private context. That's just sort of my thinking here. Hopefully that'll become clear as I dive into this. So this is case study of private environmental governance. What the heck is private environmental governance? Well, the basic idea is that is, as I have written on the screen here, it is private endeavor to achieve public environmental goods or public environmental goals that are normally achieved through government efforts. Or that's passive voice, so I could just say it's the process of private firms, private entities seeking to achieve environmental ends that we normally expect the government to strive for. That is, private firms trying to protect the environment. We're used to the government doing that, but sometimes private firms do it. Let me give a couple of examples. First, we have what I've termed multilateral collaboration as a form of private environmental governance. So many of you are probably familiar with the Marine Stewardship Council. What they do is label fish, label seafood as sustainable. And this is multilateral because what we have here in the Marine Stewardship Council is a bunch of different organizations. Seafood companies that catch and process seafood, and non-governmental organizations like I think the forgive me, I'm forgetting. I want to say Environmental Defense Fund was an early participant in the Marine Stewardship Council. I could be wrong about that, but a variety of NGOs, and then also seafood companies that sell seafood like Walmart. They've all come together in this institution, the Marine Stewardship Council, and they have said, we are going to set rules for how we behave. Now, they're not necessarily rules in the same way we'd think of laws, because anybody can come or go from this partnership as they please, but anybody who participates in the Marine Stewardship Council is agreeing to follow the rules that they create. So this is governance because it is rules that come out of this multilateral group, and the folks who participate in that group have to follow the rules. Bilateral contracting is another form of private environmental governance, and I'll continue to use the Marine Stewardship Council example, or actually maybe this is a Walmart example, but Walmart, a participant in the Marine Stewardship Council, also only sells Marine Stewardship certified seafood. That is seafood that has this check mark on it, right? That has this logo on it. Walmart only agrees to sell Marine Stewardship Council seafood in its stores. So Walmart has contracts, supply chain contracts with the folks who provide its seafood, and these contracts effectively say you shall follow, right? You shall follow all of the rules that the Marine Stewardship Council promulgates. So now we've got something that looks even a little bit more like real law, because Walmart, as a major player in the seafood industry, Walmart is requiring its suppliers to follow the rules of the Marine Stewardship Council, even if those suppliers might not have otherwise decided to do it. And now the suppliers can't just come and go. Once they sign the contract, they're obliged to follow the terms of that contract, and Walmart could take them to court if they didn't. Will Walmart take them to court? I somehow doubt it, but they could take them to court for a breach of contract if they did not follow the Marine Stewardship Council requirements. So this is bilateral contracting because we've got contract between Walmart and Galprin Seafood Company, and Walmart is governing the Galprin Seafood Company's behavior. We also have private governance through retail or individual consumption, or we could just call sort of labeling, right? Walmart labels all of its stuff with the Marine Stewardship Council logo. You can see this is not food from Walmart, I don't think, but you can see in the picture on the right the MSC logo on all of these grocery items. So we as individuals now have the option to, well, we don't have an option for a Walmart because they only sell MSC certified products, but we have the option generally to decide where we're spending our money. Do we want to support this arguably sustainable seafood production from MSC, or do we not want to spend more money if it costs more money to buy MSC certified products? So individuals are also participants in this private environmental governance universe. Now, does private environmental governance work? Well, the answer, I think, is yes. I am not, as you will see in a moment, I'm not personally a leading champion of private environmental governance, or PEG. I believe PEG is important, but I'm also a critic, and we'll get there. But what the most vocal proponents of PEG will tell you is, one, yes, it works. It works to protect the environment, at least in some specific respects. It works to protect the environment. And it works especially compared to public governance. Because what these folks will tell you is public governance isn't working at all, as we know, because we haven't managed to even begin to solve major problems like climate change. Why not? Well, the leading book on private environmental governance is this book called Beyond Politics, The Private Governance Response to Climate Change by colleague Mike Vandenberg, who is at Vanderbilt Law School, and Jonathan Gilligan, who is not a law professor. He's a, oh gosh, he is a, I can't remember, something techie at Vanderbilt as well. They've written this book called Beyond Politics. And so their argument is private governance works because it is beyond politics. We don't need to deal with partisanship and Republicans and Democrats, and they're fighting over everything, and Lord knows that's true. They say we don't need to deal with that if we're doing private environmental governance. That's their argument. Now, I'll just raise and then not talk a lot more about my one key assertion here, which is that actually private governance isn't beyond politics. Politics does influence private governance, and private governance influences politics. So I think the concept beyond politics is just wrong. But that's for another conversation. More importantly, beyond politics could be a synonym for beyond democracy. My argument here is that private environmental governance works in large part, to the extent it works, because it avoids democracy, not just politics. It avoids all the various requirements, all the various institutional hurdles that come with democracy. That could be good for getting things done, but is it good for enriching and practicing democracy? Is it arguably something like the Green Dictator? Maybe. I think it's a problem, but the others would respond. I think that Mike Vandenberg would respond. We've talked a lot about this, and he has responded. Yeah, this is true. Private environmental governance isn't a democratic endeavor the way government action is, but private environmental governance is private. So does it actually require democracy? I want to make sure to give Professor Vandenberg credit. He's a friend and a collaborator, and I think very highly of him, even though we disagree a lot on private governance. He would also say it's not just that it's private and doesn't need democracy, but also maybe it's more democratic than I think. I'll let you judge that. We'll get there in another minute. But the point is, folks say it's private. Private governance is private. So why should we even be talking about democracy? And so one of the arguments I want to make here is just sort of a vernacular one. We have this idea, which is not a vernacular idea, this idea in our heads that things that are designated as private are outside of the political democratic realm, and things that are described as public, those are inside the political democratic realm. And I just think that public-private distinction is not very helpful from a decision-making perspective. And a lot of people would agree with this, and there's lots of good writing on why the public-private distinction is not very helpful. It is, however, helpful for our language, for the vocab we're using. So public, generally, we use that term, and I use that term generally to mean related to the government, whereas private tends to be related to industry, private industry, individuals. I and others tend to use the word public to mean things that are widespread, have widespread impact, a public impact, whereas private might mean a more particularized, specialized impact. These are common ways we use the words public and private, and they don't necessarily denote this fundamental distinction. It's just useful ways of talking, which brings us sort of back to why democracy. Take two on why democracy. I want to just spend a minute back on this. So we've got the ways people use the term public and private, but I don't think that public necessarily means democracy, and private necessarily means democracy free. This is just words we use to help clarify what we mean. I don't think the terms public and private are triggers for democracy or not thinking about democracy in a given governance context. Indeed, I think that if we look back at the political theory literature, what you will see from a variety of scholars and thinkers and early philosophers is that when something is impacting liberty, that's the trigger for democracy, not the terms public-private, not who is impacting liberty, but whether there is an impact on liberty in the first place. So liberty comes in a number of forms. Generally, we think of liberty as having two aspects. two aspects, or depending on your own political philosophy, one or the other of these two aspects: liberty as non-domination and liberty as non-interference. And when we have domination, when we have interference with our individual liberty, that's the trigger for democracy, regardless of whether that interference comes from public or private actors. And this is, by the way, this is the congratulations. You are on the first ever talk I've given where I've used AI to develop an image. I put this quote, again, a long block quote that you do not have to read, into an AI image generator. And this is the image it came out with. And I thought it was compelling, if not somewhat goofy. And so I put it up here. But the basic idea of this quote, which you are welcome to read, but you do not need to read, is that I guess I'll read the first sentence. Private actors, or I'll paraphrase the first sentence. Private actors can dominate or interfere in the same way the government can. And in fact, efforts at private environmental governance, while they tend to produce environmentally positive, environmentally protective results, are further evidence that private actors can dominate or interfere with our environmental decision making. They can dominate the kind of food we eat, and the water that we drink and that we recreate in. They can affect where we live and how we live there, and so on and so forth. It's fairly obvious that private actors can dominate in the same way government can dominate. And in fact, and I would say, to me, this is sort of the Trump argument on this point. I don't mean Donald Trump. I mean the winning argument on this point. This argument trumps most of the others. To those who are big proponents of the effectiveness of private environmental governance, if you believe that private environmental governance is really effective, that private firms can and should take the reins of environmental decision-making and deliver us good outcomes, then you have to acknowledge that those firms are also able to interfere and dominate, that is, affect our liberty, because if they didn't do that, then they certainly wouldn't be able to be successful environmental governors. The fact that environmental governance is important and is effective demonstrates that private firms have some significant power over the environment and our environmental decision making. So that, to me, justifies the need to think about private environmental governance, even though it's non-governmental, to think about private environmental governance in a democratic context. And so it brings me to the question, is private environmental governance democratic? Is it democratic? Because if it's a form of governance that we are going to accede to, a form of governance that we're going to accept, if we are willing to give up some of our liberty, if we are willing to be dominated or to for private firms to interfere with us in some way, in our environmental relationships and our environmental needs in some way, we have to agree to that, at least in some sort of theoretical way. Generally, we do that through democratic practice. Is there democratic practice to sort of sign off on or legitimize private environmental governance? Well, luckily, we now know sort of the elements of democracy, and we can just run the structures of private environmental governance through these elements of democracy. So, and by the way, I'll just pause here to say, it looks like I've been talking for about 35 minutes. I think I'm right on track to give you at least 15 minutes of Q&A. So, okay, is private environmental governance democratic? How about on the majoritarian front? Is there a majoritarian aspect to private environmental governance? Well, my conclusion is no, and the reason is this. Many folks would say that, well, $1, one vote. We get to spend our money to influence the way private firms behave. We could spend our money as consumers, we could spend our money as investors, and I think all of that is true, but from my perspective, that is not majoritarianism, because majoritarianism is about one person, one vote, not $1, one vote, and some of us have a lot more dollars than others. So, I mean, I'm hardly a powerful investor, but I can afford to go to barely, but I can afford to go to Whole Foods and buy more expensive, at least nominally sustainable food, a low climate impact food, or to invest in firms that I think are doing important things for the environment. That's something I can do, but it's not majoritarian because I can do it with a lot more power than somebody else who doesn't have as much money as I do. So I don't think we have a majoritarian presence and a majoritarian aspect to private governance. However, I will say that I do think we have this form of individualism or individual contestation in environmental private governance, because that $1, one vote concept, if we say that's not majoritarian, well, it can be individualist. That is, the rich person who can make some real difference in the way private firms behave, whether as more likely as an investor than as a consumer, but even plausibly as a consumer, that person can throw their money at it and can have, as an individual, some form of success. And that's not so different from our forms of individual contestation in government. Yes, we can all sue, but the wealthier people are more likely to have a better shot when they bring a lot of money to the table in litigation. We can all speak and vocalize our objections, but of course, those who have more money can speak more loudly. We can all participate in the political process in that individualist way, but money makes a big difference there. And so in the private sphere, there's no reason that we shouldn't sort of parallel that, and therefore the sort of vote with your dollars phrasing, which I think vote is the wrong word, but the participate, the object, contest with your dollars, protest with your dollars. This, I think, does work fairly well, albeit not in an equitable way, but it does work in the private sphere just as much as it can in the public sphere. How about reason giving? I think, again, no, we don't really have reason giving opportunities or requirements in the private sphere, right? There of course are no requirements that private firms give reasons for what they're doing. But even if firms choose to give reasons, and they sometimes do, we see sustainability reports or ESG metrics and ESG reports and all of this kind of stuff, firms will give reasons sometimes, but when they give reasons, there is absolutely no requirement that they stick to those reasons or that their actual behaviors reflect their reasons in some way. Case in point, some of you may remember, what was it, maybe not quite 10 years ago, maybe it was about 10 years ago now, Volkswagen had this emissions cheating scandal. If you looked at Volkswagen's sustainability reports, they said all over the place, and I quote this and cite it if you feel like reading this article governing private governance, but they say, we believe that some things are more important than profit. We believe that protecting the planet and protecting human rights and human livelihoods is our top priority, even before our share price and our profits. And that was, let's just say, their 2013 sustainability report. And then in 2014, some months later, we discovered that they've been cheating the emissions tests. So, not all firms are bad actors in that way, but all firms in the same way are not obligated to act on the reasons they give. And that, as we will come back to, is not true in government democratic practice. Lastly, deliberation. Again, no. Firms may or may not deliberate about their private governance decisions, but there's no transparent, built-in, replicable process for that, as there is in government decision-making. Firms just don't need to deliberate. They can act by fiat if they choose, and the government, by and large, cannot. Okay, so is private environmental governance democratic? I say no, it's not, because the only real democratic element we see in private environmental governance is this form of individual contestation. Important, necessary, but not sufficient to make a democratic institution. Which brings us to the final part of this talk. How then do we democratize, right? The talk is titled Towards Democratic Environmental Governance. I spent a lot of time explaining why we need it and how we don't have it, at least not in the private governance context. So how do we democratize? And this actually, what I'm about to say is primarily structured for this private environmental governance case study. So how do we democratize private environmental governance? But what I have to say here, I think, is also very much true for how we can democratize governance, public governance, the government. That is, the things I'm going to say draw on what I think are some of the highlights of public governance, including public, especially public environmental governance. But just because they're highlights doesn't mean they're perfectly implemented in our public universe, in our government. And so we can look at these and say, these are good. How do we do them better? Not just how do we impose them or integrate them into private governance. So there's two aspects to how do we to the answer, how do we democratize? One is looking at administrative governance. That is, administrative agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency and our other administrative agencies, administrative law in the US, looking at administrative governance as a model, figuring out what works best in administrative governance and trying to apply that in private governance. And then thinking about how we, not just in private governance, but in the political universe at large, in the democratic universe at large, how we just do democracy better. So let's dive in to that, beginning with this question of administrative governance as a model. So we start with our elements of democracy. We look at majoritarianism. One of the features of administrative governance, let's just take the Environmental Protection Agency as a model. The Environmental Protection Agency, the president controls it to a significant extent. The president appoints the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. The president can fire the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. But the president oversees the Environmental Protection Agency through the Office of Management and Budget, through direct direction to the administrator and to the budget that the president proposes, right? So the president has a significant amount of control, and of course the president is elected. And then Congress. EPA can't do much without congressional authorization. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, I bet you guys don't know about this law, the Noise Control Act and the Quiet Communities Act. Yes, another thing I'm working on is noise law, but I wasn't quite prepared to talk about that this summer, maybe next time. But there's all these federal laws. Congress passes these laws. Congress structures these laws and tells EPA or any other administrative agency what kind of authority it has. And of course, Congress is also elected. So we've got this powerful majoritarian aspect to administrative governance. I say that parenthetically, incidentally, despite the fact that many opponents of administrative governance would say, but it's unelected bureaucrats, it's insulated technocrats making decisions. And the answer is that's not true. I mean, yes, insulated, unelected bureaucrats and technocrats have a role to play here, but to say this is a non-majoritarian process would be really simplifying how the system works. Second, individual contestation. We also have tons of this in government and in administrative governance specifically. The First Amendment, petitioning process, the Administrative Procedure Acts, petitioning opportunities. You can petition to make a rule or repeal a rule, and of course, Article 3's ability to sue. All of this exists in spades in the administrative state. There is lots of reason giving as well. I also talked about sort of the due process, reason giving, and requirements of reasonableness. The Administrative Procedure Act requires notice and comment and must give notice of new rules. The arbitrary and capricious standard in administrative law in the Administrative Procedure Act requires agencies to give reasons for what they're doing. If they do not give reasons for what they're doing, then they have been arbitrary and capricious, and their agency action will be overturned. And we just saw this Ohio v. EPA case this past term, a really bad decision for a variety of reasons, but that decision really focused in on this idea of arbitrary and capricious decision making and what reason giving looks like, and definitely going a step or two or 10 too far, said you really have to give reasons, and that includes responding to every single comment you receive at a very specific level, in a very specific way. That is reason giving, and the requirement of reason giving applied to the administrative state. Deliberation, very similarly to reason giving, agencies not just have to give notice of what they do, they have to receive comments and deliberate and respond to those comments. The arbitrary and capricious standard requires them to express in not just the reasons they're acting, but how they thought through the various policy options. That is to sort of show their work, to put their deliberation on paper. So administrative governance is a good model. And why couldn't we see a model like this in the private sphere? Maybe there should be some voting over private environmental governance decisions. Maybe firms should create platforms for public voting, or to elect the sustainability officers or something like that. Unrealistic, perhaps, but nevertheless, certainly a democratic tool. On the individualist side, we're trying to create individual leverage over private environmental decision making. The B corporation or benefit corporation structure is one way to think about this. It gives individuals more opportunity to challenge not just state shareholders, but broader stakeholders, to challenge private decision making. Or when we've got supply chain contracts like the ones I discussed at the beginning with Walmart and the Galperin Seafood Company, what if those contracts said that individuals could sue as a third-party beneficiary if the parties were breaching the contract but chose not to institute a lawsuit themselves, just as one example. Reason giving. Perhaps the private firms could create clearer goals, not just a sustainability statement, but specific goals in a sustainability report, and then link any environmental governance activity to those specific goals, to give a basis, to give an expression, a reason for what they're doing, but making that reason more fixed and public and transparent. And in the deliberative space, maybe there's more opportunity for public feedback. Maybe private firms accept public comments, and then actually respond to public feedback, as we see in the notice and comment process. So this is one way to democratize, but I want to assert, and I'll end on this notion, that the most important way to democratize is not just that private firms do better, but that the government also do better, right? We have already a democratic structure in our government. Is it democratic enough? No. Does the administrative state work perfectly? Far from it. But we have these democratic models there. We have these institutions there. And we should be participating in democracy, in government democracy, so that we are getting the government to do better. So all of these things on this page that I suggest private firms might be doing, well, the government can force them to do that if we, the public, ask the government to force them to do that. So what we have to do is, when we're thinking about something like private governance, not say private firms will solve our problems, private firms are beyond politics, and that's the way to do it. We got to get away from politics and away from democracy, and use these systems that are more where the skids have been greased, and we can just more quickly get beyond the hurdles of government. Because when we do that, when we get beyond politics, beyond the hurdles of government, beyond democracy, when we do that, what we're doing is weakening our democratic systems. Because as I said early on in the talk, democracy isn't just this pre-political, atomized individuals who have these beliefs that don't change, and we therefore just need a system to express our beliefs. We are political individuals. We change based on our participation in the political process, based on our participation in the democratic process. And for that reason, we need to participate in democracy in order to keep democracy going, and to turn just to private firms or green dictatorship or pure rationality, where we say we can remove the fighting, we can remove the people, we can remove the debate and the values and all of that, and just do it by letting private firms do it, or letting mathematicians do it, or letting a green dictator do it. If we do that, then we're saying we don't need to do democracy. And when we stop doing democracy, we really weaken our ability to be political participants. And for that reason, even though I think we can democratize private governance, the better thing to do is strengthen our own government systems to participate in those systems better. And that, in turn, will give us the power to reach the environmental goals that we probably should. Okay, I think I'll end it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Josh. We do have maybe a minute for a couple questions. If people have them, they can certainly enter them in the chat section of the VLGS YouTube site. But I'll just start, Josh, with a question for you that occurs to me from your talk, which was extremely, I think, thought-provoking and really set up the different structures really cogently so that we can sort of, one of the helpful things about scholarship is that we can start to put sort of labels and names on things that are happening around us. And one thing that I was wondering how you think about is the middle ground where we have in our administrative state this vast array of sort of privately managed governance structures that have, as you say, some sort of public endorsement, whether it be the regional transmission operators that are running our electric grid, whether it be the cleanup system that certifies that private cleanups are happening appropriately. There's certainly a bunch of different models. And I'm wondering how you see that sort of very common feature of environmental law, where there is this private entity coming up with all the rules and running through a process that's pseudo-public, but not really, and looks a lot more like private environmental governance. How do you see those sort of that middle ground?
Yeah, terrific question. And it goes even beyond that, because there's a lot of places where regulations incorporate by reference private standards. And the government has nothing to say about the standards themselves. They just say, we're bringing them in, right? And the answer is, well, as you said, it's a middle ground. So I'll try to give a very short answer, which is, I think we need more opportunity for public participation in that process. I think when we have these public-private hybrids, the courts or Congress need to recognize that these hybrids are publicizing, that's not really the word I want to use, but are making these private processes public, and therefore all of the various opportunities for input into the public system, we also ought to have into the private system. We can't just say, oh, well, that's private, so therefore there's no right to sue or no right to petition or whatever. We have to recognize that they have become public systems. Having said that, I will say that they are better than pure private governance, because they are at least endorsed at the government level, and therefore the endorsement itself is a government action, which as individuals we can challenge in a number of ways.
Maybe we are running close to the end here. We have maybe I'll ask one more question of you, Josh.
Okay.
The sort of critique of private governance structures feels an interesting sort of line of inquiry now, given just how the private governance structures, at least the more prominent ones, have been under political attack, as you sort of referenced in your talk, and in a much more profound way than I think anyone would have imagined 5 years ago. I'm wondering what you take from the fact that some of those governance structures, Climate Action 100+, for example, is one that comes to mind, or there's other coalitions of businesses that formed and had grand goals and standards, and some of them seem to be more brittle than may have originally appeared. So I'm wondering if you have any reflections on whether more democracy would have helped those sort of networks and structures work better, or whether they're sort of suffering in part in their efficacy now because there's greater public scrutiny, and the political winds sort of are attacking them.
Yeah, two parts to that answer. First, which I think you've implied, and I'll just reiterate, which is this is evidence that the private stuff is not beyond politics, right? I mean, what we're seeing here is when firms started making these big promises, sustainability, ESG promises, the people who don't believe in that issue, it's not that they just think government shouldn't do it, it's they don't think anybody should do it, right? And those folks, Ron DeSantis, for example, they turn on the political heat and the firms back off. So this is not beyond politics, and to say it is I would say perhaps not dishonest, but at least it's wearing blinders. So that's part one. Part two, how would these democratic structures have made it better? Well, one, they might not. I mean, one of the conceits of democracy, I guess, is what I want isn't always what we're going to get. I would rather live in a world where we have a stable climate and equitable distribution of environmental burdens and limited environmental burdens in the first place, and have a society that agrees on that. But short of that, I'd rather live in a society where we have a functioning democratic system than one that just imposes democratic ends. I believe that in a functioning democratic system, we will strive for environmental ends, but I can't be sure of that. And the politics of this moment suggests perhaps that that we aren't necessarily going to strive to democratic ends. However, because these firms don't really have democratic institutional structures, they're not responding to a sort of nothing is clean, but a cleaner signal through all the political noise. They're responding to what they hear most directly. If they had a more diverse, pluralistic democratic system in which to make decisions, they might actually be making better decisions. So, and probably somewhat stickier decisions as well.
Well, I think that is a great way to end it. And we're seeing a lot of this play out in, I think, much more prominent ways than one might have expected. And this is a very fruitful area. So we're sort of looking forward to continued scholarship in this area, and we'll be following it. So we're out of time for today, and want to thanks again to Professor Galbraith for the presentation. And thanks to all the viewers out there for joining us today. Our next talk in our Hot Topic series will be online Thursday this week, same time, same place. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. And thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.